So last week we talked about existentialism, and so this week we're thinking about how we can apply those existentialist principles to real life. So Simone de Beauvoir is known to be an existentialist feminist, and she and Sartre were in direct communication with one another. They knew each other, they even dated, and so it is interesting to kind of see where one can apply these existentialist principles to the real lived experience of gender. And so Simone de Beauvoir is known to be a feminist, but what does that mean? Because the term feminism is kind of thrown around a lot and it has a negative connotation. So I kind of want to set that straight. So for Simone de Beauvoir, her understanding of feminism has to do with someone's opportunities and someone's ability to be free. So we're not really thinking about solely one aspect of feminism with respect to equality and, job equality or the payroll, or specifically the pay gap, or reproductive rights. We're thinking about opportunities and freedom in general, which obviously includes how much women are getting paid, whether women can control their reproductive rights, etc. So with feminism and Simone de Beauvoir, she's really thinking about how has being a woman impacted someone in terms of their opportunities, in terms of their ability to be authentic and express themselves, and their ability to live freely and to transcend. Because if you remember from Sartre, to be human is to transcend. It's to be free. It's to be able to go beyond our facticity and the givens in life. But what happens when you are part of an oppressed category in society, such as that of women? Can you truly be free? Can you truly transcend? Well, you can technically still transcend and be free, but there's a lot more complications. And that's what Sartre perhaps didn't really think about or didn't really focus on in existentialism as humanism. So Simone de Beauvoir then is using these existentialist principles to say, yes, we can think about freedom, we can think about authenticity, but how do we do it and how do we think about it when it comes to the lived experience and the lived reality of being a woman, which is a marginalized group in our society? So you had read the introduction, which is just a tiny bit of a much larger book called The Second Sex. And in The Second Sex, de Beauvoir kind of asks the question of, well, why am I even writing a book on women? This was published in 1949, so this is kind of the beginning of people starting to think about feminism and feminist theory and the condition of women and gender. And, prior to then, people really thought that gender and sex were the same, sex in terms of biological characteristics, chromosomes, hormones, etc. And so at this point in the 40s and the 30s and the 50s, you see more people thinking about how gender is distinct from sex. And so gender is something that can be socially constructed, at least in terms of it not being determined by our physiological sex. And so this is why writing a book on women can be so frustrating, because she says that everyone's talking about it. It's kind of the new thing in fashion. People haven't necessarily been really productive when talking about women or feminism. And so people have been kind of vague about it. And so that's why she poses a question, well, what does it even mean to be a woman? Is it specifically a term that relates to people who are passive or obedient? Because there are people who are writing in magazines and books and they're saying that there are no longer women, that women are an endangered group. Well, obviously there are still women, but the idea of being a subservient, obedient, passive woman, that is becoming endangered. And so that's why she says we need to be specifically careful about what it means to be a woman. And so she gives different responses that people have provided throughout science and philosophy and religion. And so one of the statements that's been made about women is that people say, well, every human being is uniquely situated, and so woman is just a uniquely situated human being. But de Beauvoir says that definition is really vague, and it doesn't really help us understand what it means to be a woman and woman's condition. And so, yes, we are all uniquely situated. Think back to Sartre. We're thrown into the world, and we have subjectivity, and we decide who we are going to be. But women specifically are a category. We are a category in society. So then how do we try to understand the lived experiences of what it means to be a woman? And this is why we do have to think about how, of course, women's experiences differ from one another, but there has to be some sort of singularity when it comes to describing the category of women. And that's what de Beauvoir is trying to do, or at least she's thinking about whether this is possible or not. And so therefore, if we're thinking about what it means to be a woman, we can't just talk about abstract categories and human beings being uniquely situated, because that's not how reality is. Think back to Marx. We have to think about real human beings embedded in real struggles and real oppression, real exploitation. And so this is what de Beauvoir is thinking about in The Second Sex, the different stages of what it means to be a woman. She starts out talking in later on in the lived experience sections, she starts out talking about the child, the girl, the woman in love, the married woman, the mother, and then the conclusion. And so in all of these different chapters, she's trying to assess whether a woman is truly free or not. How can she transcend? And so in order to understand woman's condition, we have to think about what it means to be a man. Because insofar as we live in a patriarchal society where there are specific privileges that are given to men, not necessarily because of any kind of idea that they deserve these privileges, but just because they are socialized to be men, they are born into these bodies, etc. So there are certain rights that men have that women still don't necessarily have, or privileges and opportunities that men have that women still don't necessarily have, even though things have gotten much better since the days that Beauvoir was writing. So if we're thinking about what it means to be a woman, we have to understand what it means to be a man, because the idea of what it means to be a woman is understood in relation to what it means to be a man. So if we're thinking about what it means to be a woman, even just think about the term woman. So the idea of a woman comes from how we differentiate women from men in society. And so Beauvoir says that men are viewed as the neutral, as the norm, as the absolute, as the objective. And so what does this mean? When we think about our identities, of course we think about ourselves in specific ways, but oftentimes, especially in philosophy, in the history of Western philosophy, there has been an abstract human being that's been presupposed into our theories, when in fact that abstract human being is not anyone, it's actually a man, because most of the history of Western philosophy has been written by men. So obviously they're going to infuse their experiences and their perspective and their understanding of the world into their theories. And so Beauvoir says that to be a woman means that you are viewed as a deviation from what's viewed as neutral and absolute and universal. And so she talks about how woman is defined negatively in relation to man. So she's not understood in relation to herself, she's understood in relation to man. And this is where she gives the quotes from famous philosophers and religious theorists who talk about how women are a defect in relation to men, or they lack something that men don't have. So they're not thought of as something significant and objective and absolute. They're thought of as a deviation, as inferior, as something insignificant to man when it comes to how we conceptualize women. And so this is why she says that man is viewed as a self in society and woman is viewed as the other. So she's this thing that doesn't have everything that a man has. Man is viewed as rational and strong and superior, and woman is viewed as emotional and weak and passive. And so it's not as if all men think of themselves as, oh, I'm a man, I'm stronger, and women suck. That's not what she's saying. But she's saying that given how men are socialized to view themselves as masculine, as strong, as and people who should initiate everything, and women are socialized to view themselves as weaker or more passive or not as strong as men. So there's these different ways that we are socialized, and this is how it's kind of manifested in our society, where of course we can have specific rights and privileges, but then how also do we think of ourselves in relation to others? So man is viewed as a self, woman is viewed as the other, man is viewed as the absolute subject from which we inquire about everything, and woman is viewed as the object. So for example, think about how women are objectified. Oftentimes when people describe women, they specifically start out discussing how they look and their appearances rather than what they're saying or how they speak or their intelligence. And so with men, people tend to start out by, well, this person's really smart, or this person is very advanced in their career. So those are just some of the differences. And even the ways, just think about the media and how women are objectified through the media constantly. I posted that video, Misrepresentation, so I highly recommend watching that. But women are viewed as the other in relation to men who are viewed as a self. And she says that, of course, there are other oppressor-oppressed relationships where one is a self, one is the other, but there's lack of reciprocity when it comes to men and women. Women aren't viewed as being independent, and men are not viewed as being dependent upon women. But both men and women are dependent upon one another for various reasons in the society that we live in, but it's only viewed as women being dependent upon men. So unlike the master-slave dialectic that we talked about with Marx and Hegel, where you have the master, you have the slave, and the slave recognizes his independence because the master is just as dependent upon him as he is upon the master, we see this master-slave dynamic between men and women, but women's independence is not the outcome of that situation. There is a lack of reciprocity. Women's abilities is not recognized as the outcome of that dialectical conflict. So this is how there is a lack of relativity and reciprocity when it comes to men and women. And so she says that women haven't necessarily done a lot to also change their condition. So we'll talk more about this in the next video.